We've been making games for 3 years at this point, and during that process we definitely got better at making games. Because if you take a look at our first game, Forge Industry, it was a questionable game. Let's be honest, it's currently sitting at a hot mixed review over on Steam because there are just some big problems with the game. First off, as you can see, the visuals, what are those? But also in terms of actual gameplay mechanics, game design, and all of that basically, it was a bit of a nightmare. It was one of those projects, you know, that we started as a game jam and then we kept on working on that shitty, sandy foundation for the next 18 months basically, leading to a game with some big issues. Now, since we released that game, we definitely improved a lot and we learned a lot of new stuff. And that brings me to the question, could we make something better? Because it's a question we also get often of like, hey, are you ever planning on making a sequel to Forge Industry? Because to a certain degree, I think the idea of making a factory automation game where there are no conveyor belts is pretty interesting. Now, for the longest part, I've said no, but I'm going to be making a kind of mini exception today because we're going to be recreating Forge Industry and kind of reliving that game jam vibe, seeing how much of this game we can recreate in 24 hours. How are we going to do that? Because I am not a good programmer, and once again, it's a very technically heavy game. We're going to be using today's video sponsor for that, Bezzy. Bezzy is an AI assistant for Unity, so Godot Bros and Unreal Bros, I'm sorry, you're going to have to sit this one out, and it can help you with working on your games. So I've worked with it a bunch before, but I think what's really powerful about it is that, hey, it's not just like ChatGPT where you can ask it a question and then it's going to answer. No, it has one, context of what are your prefabs, for example, what's your code structure like and all of that. And two, it can actually write the code straight for you. It can create shaders. It can do all of that. So I'm going to give you a small spoiler. I'm not going to write a single line of code for this video. I'm just going to say the mechanics that I want. I'm going to give it a bunch of prompts and we're going to see how far we can go. But we'll dive into that in a second. Let's first talk about what are the main goals of this. Just to give a quick recap of what is Forge Industry. Because I said, yeah, it's a factory automation game without conveyor belts. What does this mean? The core hook is that you are a blacksmith and you have a bunch of different buildings like your forges, your refinement station and all of that, and you have your automation process. You start by buying ore, you transport the ores to the refinement station, you melt them, and you bring them to like all these different stations, and you have all these different buildings that you need to interconnect with each other. But because we are in a fantasy medieval setting, there are no conveyor belts, because have you ever seen a conveyor belt in Dark Ages? I don't think so, right? So instead we use the good old Mark I human that just takes a box and moves it around. And this gives a different approach to strategy because we now had like multi-hop workers, you had pods, you had pod finding, so that you had to manage the congestion management and all of that. And then you had all of the different workstations and you had to transport everything in between each other and you had to manage the workers as your primary resource. Now, like I said, we spent 18 months on making the full game, so I'm not fully certain how much we're going to get done in that 24-hour period, but I think some things that I definitely want to have, of course, is building placements, worker assignments, and just making like simple routes and whatever. And maybe while we're at it, make it a prettier game as well. And just see a bit more what can AI help us with that honestly I have no experience with, because I have some cool ideas in that, especially in regards to like game feel that we'll discover later on. The first thing we did was pretty easy. I wanted a top-down camera controller for my world, so it's literally just as easy as going into Bezzy and asking, hey, I'm looking for an RTS style top-down camera controller where I can move around, I can rotate around and all of that. Can you help me with this? And after like 2 minutes, basically, I had the entire movement system working already for my camera navigation. Easy win, right? Now I can look around on a plane. Exciting. But now we start getting to the more important things, because one big thing that I wasn't certain about for this game is what should I do for the approach of placing buildings? Because there's two approaches, basically. Well, mainly two approaches. Forge Industry uses grids, which means that the entire world is subdivided. Forge Industry 1 was also voxel based, kind of. And then you just moved around on the grid, so buildings would snap to the grid. Or you could do things like freeform placement, where the terrain was more freeform and I could put them down wherever I wanted. I wasn't really certain which approach I should go for, so this is once again something where Bezzy, having that understanding as well of Unity, of code and all of that, can help with it. So I asked it first to, hey, what are these two big differences? What would be the optimal approach given the use case for my game? What would you recommend and all of that? And give me a like plan of action to implement a grid system, for example, because that's the style I ended up going with. It gave me a lot of explanation. I learned a bit more about how grid systems work, like how placements in Unity work, because there's benefits and downsides to both approaches. Freeform is going to be a bit more tricky in terms of pod finding and route management, whereas the grid-based approach will always look a little bit less natural, I would say. We ended up going with grid though. And then you can ask Bezzy, hey, how would I implement this entire grid system just to give you the steps? But then you can basically pull a Uno reverse card and be like, psych, you implement this as well now by switching into agent mode, where you just wait for 2-3 minutes and suddenly there is an entire grid. There's some really cool things that we did kind of wrong in Forge Industry that we're doing better now. For example, in Forge Industry, our grid system was just by swapping textures on every single terrain tile, which was a miserable and inefficient experience. Here, I could just say, hey, I'm looking for a grid shader. Can you write one for me? And once again, a minute later, I had this shader. It was a neat grid. I can customize things like color very easily, and there wasn't really much I needed to do for it. Once again, I think it's really nice just how quickly the game could progress this way. And I felt like, hey, nothing can go wrong now, right? AI is here to take my job. Not entirely. We'll dive into that in a second. And with that first grid system implementation, now we could get started with working on actually creating the different buildings that you can place down in the game. And I think this is one of those things where, I'm here to tell you that whilst AI is really, really powerful, as you'll see, it's not fully there yet to take your job. Because when you want to place down buildings in your world, for example, there's a bunch of different ways of how to approach this mechanically, game design-wise, architecture-wise for your code and whatever. That can be a problem if you don't fully understand what you're going for. I think that's the thing with this automation game and why the original Forge Industry took us 18 months to make, is because we also didn't understand back then how software architecture really worked for games like this. So this is where it is very handy for me as well to look back at the old project we made basically and look at all of the things that, this was a very bad implementation of how we did buildings, for example. Let's do it differently now. Because if you just say, hey, I want a building system, go and implement it for me, chances are you're going to get something that whilst technically works, first try, it's going to be something that doesn't really scale. It's going to do a lot of refactoring or whatever. You need to have a better understanding of knowing how to guide it to make the perfect thing. So for example, how we did is, hey, we have a generic building script, for example, that features data like, for example, what is the size of my buildings that's being stored in there, and what is like the worker spawn positions of every worker who's going to join a building, where should they be? Because those are things that, you need some sort of architecture. It's also how do you manage the placements in your game? Are you going to make like 20 different managers and you're going to put them all in your hierarchy? Maybe that's not the best approach for your game. Maybe you want to use different design patterns. Having an understanding of those things is really important, I think, still, because that way you can also make Bezzy do the best approach basically. And sure, this does require some idea of knowing how do you want your architecture to be. Do you want it to be singleton based? Do you want it to be event driven and all of that? And one cool thing here with the Bezzy as well is that you can create project rules so that you do not have to repeat like your entire boilerplate statement of do not create automatic setup scripts for me or stick to these design practices and whatever. You can just tell it once for everything in your project, give it all of the context it needs, and then it can start working from that, keeping those things in mind of like, hey, these are the different approaches you should do for code, the coding styles, and how everything should interact with each other. Once again, I think really powerful, and especially with me being able to guide it of, hey, I want scriptable objects for storing my core data, and then I want to have a prefab, and that prefab has some data as well, and then just have it all in a hotbar. Me already kind of knowing what I wanted and giving it more specific tips on this is the implementation I wanted did really help here as well. So now we have building placement, but it kind of looks, not ideal is I think the best way I could say it. Yeah, it works. I can place down the buildings on my grid, but this does not really feel like that interesting of a game yet. And I think this brings me to my favorite part of tools like Bezzy, and that is that fun stuff of game development that is basically game feel. I think this is something that I love AI for. Whether it is, oh, I have this button, but the button is not fun to click. Hey, give me a button feel script. Very easy to crank out. It now has like the little tweenings and it zooms in and out. That's one thing, really easy to make your game like feel more interactive. But then the second thing I wanted to, and this was something that I was really curious about, honestly, of like how good it was gonna go, is placing down buildings. First, I had the idea of, okay, I'm gonna place down a building and it should have like some pop effect. That's like the standard thing you see in a lot of these games of, you place it down and it not just instantly appears, but there's like a little bit of a wiggle or whatever. Generally, you would use tools like the feel assets from Unity for this, but I was like, screw it, we have an AI with feel at home. So I asked it, hey, Can you make this thing feel better? That's the fun thing, I would say, where you can just tell it in normal language, I have this thing, whether it's a button or a building placement or anything else, make it feel better. And it will just go and try a bunch of different stuff. And you can see, okay, you can guide it off, okay, I like this, I don't like this, can we change this and everything like that? So the first step was, like I said, having just the building pop in and out. And then I was like, hey, let's take this a step further. Can you do things like, for example, having that wireframe shader where it appears and slowly builds it up? Can we have some screen shake and whatever? And this was basically in a total of 10 minutes. I went from having completely static building placement to, I would say, pretty nice, juicy feeling building placement. It did stuff like the shaders for me. I didn't have to do any of that. I just said, make this thing feel good. And basically, Bazzy did it, which I think is awesome. I've been using this for a lot of my games, honestly, and maybe you've tuned into some of the prototyping streams that I've been doing with them as well, where I'm just like, hey, make this thing feel good. And then 5 minutes later, the game feel is already so much better. Because I think this is something that is really nice with that rapid prototyping, where before it's like, I'll add polish later, because you kind of know it's kind of going to be a pain, because it just takes a lot of time and you have to be like, what should I do here? How can I make this thing look better? Whereas now you can just, if you want a little break from a main mechanic, be like, hey, make this thing more fun. And in 15 minutes, your game has gone from an okay, technically working game to something that feels way more like a game. And I think that's something that I am really happy with, because at the end of the day, game juice is so important, even early on in your game's development, when prototyping and playtesting, especially with other people, to make sure that your game feels like an actual game and not just a spreadsheet simulator. And then we got to the mother load of this task, basically, which is routes and path finding. Just to give you some context, path finding alone in Forge Industry took us, I would say, a full 2.5 months with a whole bunch of rewrites and a custom implementation of A-star and everything like that. So I knew this was gonna be a tough one, and I wasn't even really certain if it was gonna work, yes or no. And to be honest, the first times it didn't work. I asked it to be like, I did the mistake that I told you, because I've been learning a lot about this now, where I was just like, okay, I have my buildings, implement path finding now, because I want basically workers to go from this building to this building. That is not good enough. And this is something where, for example, you want to talk this through in advance, basically with the AI, so it has an understanding of what are your needs and all of that before you're just like, okay, give me path finding. Because what is path finding? There's so many ways. That's a problem I think you would have as well if I asked you to implement path finding, because there are so many changes. So the first approach we tried out was A-star. That was miserable. And then in the end, I was just like, screw it. Screw A-star path finding with like the asset for it, basically. Let's just write it ourselves once again. We have that grid-based approach, which is something we talked about in that first design meeting, I would say, of should we go for grid-based or terrain-based? Because we have the grid, it's way easier to custom implement an A-star implementation and do path finding between buildings. So we just started once again from the basics. Rapid iteration is always a key here, where the first goal was simply make the workers like teleport step by step over the grid using a tick system. That was the approach we landed upon. Once I had a clear enough idea of the mechanic I wanted, honestly, path finding was very easy to implement. It was just me struggling with finding what is the correct approach. That was more of the issue. And I think that's also partially just a lack of me understanding how does Unity work, how does these assets work, how does path finding work? Whereas if I had given this to someone like a William or a Thomas, the other developers on our team who worked on path finding in original Forge Industry, I think they could just probably knock this out first try without much of an issue, with more edge case support and all of that. Now, in my case, I'm still pretty happy with it, because the first approach I had was, okay, the workers just teleport one by one over the roads, which, sure, once again, it worked, but it wasn't ideal. But this is where that rapid iteration came in once again, because once I had that first version working, all I had to do then was just improve on it. Be like, hey, right now they teleport, and there's like some edge cases where they teleport and then their destination, they only stay there for one frame instead of one tick. Can you fix this? A minute later, it's fixed. Okay, we have that one fixed. Now I don't want them to teleport anymore. Can we tween them in between all of the tiles so it just looks like they're walking, throw in an animation controller, and that's it. And once again, few minutes, basically first try, we had this working as well. And that gives us most of the game already. Now there's a lot of other stuff that I implemented as well, like being able to delete buildings. I think another thing that I think visually was an improvement compared to the previous Forge Industry was instead of using models for roads, using the Unity terrain instead, and letting the terrain get altered basically depending on whether you place down a building and the style of building just changes the floor and all of that. It's maybe something simple to you, but for me it was something that, wow, one, I didn't even know this was possible, and two, wow, this looks way better than I imagined. Most of the game kind of is there already. Sure, it's not perfect, but for having spent one single day on this game, the state that we've been able to go from basically starting hour to ending hour has been absolutely insane. I think this style of rapid prototyping is crazy because the build that we ended up with right now, basically, there was 4 months of development for Forge Industry. I'm not even joking. It really took that long to get to a point where we could see to that same degree of 1, is this game fun? 2, does this game have potential? And 3, is this the game for us to make? Because maybe I realize now as well of, okay, vibe coding an entire automation game, maybe it's not perfect for me, a noob developer. Maybe there are better genres for me to do that, but these are things where we can scale down the time from months to literally just hours or days. I think that is honestly amazing. And if it's something that you're interested in as well, I have good news for you, because you can try out Bazzy entirely for free. They offer 100 free credits, which honestly is a lot. I think all of this that you see on screen now has been made in about 80 credits total of use. So you can basically make your own Forge Industry as well. Now, one final thing I want to talk about here as well is that Bazzy, while here in this case we just prototyped a new game, you don't have to do that. One of the whole things is that it can also deal with massive projects. That's what it's built for as well. So maybe you don't want it to change code, but instead you want it to help you debug. Maybe there has been this one very weird, hard to reproduce bug for the last half a year or something in your giant project. Well, you can just put in Bazzy as well and ask it, hey, where are these things going wrong? And it will actually look for you, go through the entire code base and help you with pinpointing where are these issues at. That's an approach that we've done as well for some of our larger scope games. That's how the programmers of our team, Thomas and William, use this tool as well. Less to write the code for them, but more to validate why are these things going wrong. Because as you know, there are some bugs that you look at and it's just like, I don't know where to begin. How do I explain this? How do I figure out where this problem comes from and all of that? So if that's something that you're interested in as well, I honestly highly encourage you to try out Bazzy, especially since there is a free tier. And trust me, you're gonna fall in love with it, because I fell in love with it as well. I think I'm gonna keep using this for every single project basically. I've been prototyping so much more in the last few months and it's been an amazing experience for me to begin with. So thank you everyone for watching. Like I said, if you have no idea what to do next, go over to bazzy.com and just try it out for yourself, whether it is to figure out what is going wrong in your old project or just start prototyping a new one. Apart from that, thank you very much for watching. Forge Industry 2 for now is not going to come out anytime soon. I'm sorry. This was just a Forge Industry 1.5, I would say. At some point, maybe we'll make Forge Industry 2. It's kind of a thing that we do feel like we want to revisit at some point, but it's going to be a bit more thought out because, well, for the OG fans, you know I like my trains. Thank you very much for watching, everybody, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!